President Zhang Chang, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's really very a great occasion to be here this morning. First of all, I'd like to extend my own very warm welcome to all of you. As the President said, this is now the 10th year of the Asia Global Institute, and I'm just so proud to see the way the Institute has been developing, and of course, before that, 5 years of the Fung Global Institute. And I'd like to take this opportunity to really congratulate and thank the Hong Kong University for really being such a great home to AGI and all the developments under Hei Wei Tang, Executive Director. I'm really here to address this particular topic, which I think is something that is very close to our hearts, especially, as the President said, after the recent US election, I think all of us are now thinking hard about this issue. Now, there are many aspects that we can address from a global standpoint, but today, and because of the nature of AGI, I'd like to really look at the situation, quickly tell you how I see the situation evolving, perhaps from a businessman standpoint, how the real economy is actually faring and how it's going to do and react to this environment. But importantly, I'd like to spend a few minutes just setting the stage for our discussion later on the impact of this on the emerging economies. People talk a lot about the giants, and every day in the newspaper you talk about, really the big economy, but what is the impact on the, developing economies, the emerging economies? How would they fare in this whole scenario? So that is really the way we want to focus this morning's discussion, and indeed, this particular edition of the AGD, the Asia Global Dialogue, I think we would really like to examine that particular question. Now, let me just first of all give you a very quick sketch of how things stand. Obviously, the only word to describe it from a business standpoint is turmoil. But there are silver linings in this. The way I would describe the environment very briefly is everybody, I'm not going to go into the geopolitics because all of you read this every day in the papers. The only thing I would say about the geopolitics is, despite some of the best efforts for many of you in the room, I'm reconciled to the fact, that's the way I should put it, to the fact that the US-China relations is unlikely to improve in the short run. And, it was not easy for me to say what I just said. I was really hoping that, and working hard to try and actually make that happen, but I think we have to accept reality. It is unlikely. And if you press me, what do you mean by the short term? I would say at least 5 years. So this is the environment that we're going to have to deal with. That is reality. Now, the second reality is all of us here, I think, are very much focused on the Asian economies, right? Where we say, in fact, I still go around making speeches on the Asian century, that the center of gravity, economic center of gravity of the world will be moving to Asia. I still believe that. But I have to tell you, probably more towards the middle of the century than now. 2050, I think I will be very confident to tell you that the bulk of the world's consumption will be in Asia. Okay, but what about the next 5 to 10 years? For a businessman planning in a reasonable time horizon, the reality there is also very straightforward. The global demand, especially accessible demand that you can actually get at effectively because of the consolidation of the markets, it's actually still in the US market and the European market. In fact, if you take those two markets and add it together, it's still accounting for 46% of global consumption. So what are you facing? If I'm a global trader and I'm really thinking about the developments, the reality is it's a very, adverse geopolitical environment that's unlikely to change, and you're trying to access still the major markets, which is US and Europe. So that is the reality. Now, what do we do? Now, it seemed like a very complex and difficult, challenging issue, but I tell you, all of us on the ground, and it's actually happening, by the way, very fast, is really responding in the following way. The old pattern, now I call it old pattern, as recently as I would say 3 to 4, maybe 5 years ago, this was the very strong pattern. China was the world's factory. Everything was basic, everything. The great bulk of the products were made in China. After you finish the product, you ship it to America and you ship it to Europe. Those were the two global trade lanes, principal trade lanes bar none. Okay, that's the picture. And it was that for about 20 years before that. Made in China, shipped to US, shipped to Europe. Now, because of this geopolitical situation, that is no longer possible. And it's going to face a lot of difficulties. All of you are going to be asking about tariffs. And I tell you what, my answer is very straightforward. If the tariffs come in, people will adjust. I hope they will not come in as severity that has been sort of said in the press. But if it does come in, people will adjust in the best way possible. But there will be two effects. One is people will try to work with it, but at the same time, the ultimate burden of the tariffs will be on the consumer in the developed markets, US and Europe. But let me tell you about the reaction. So for the businessmen facing this situation, what people have been doing is take the components that have been manufactured in China and the machinery and so on, you ship it to another country like Vietnam, and you do the last stage of the supply chain in Vietnam, and with enough local content. So under very strict WTO rules, you actually get a country of origin Vietnam. After this country of origin Vietnam, what do? You ship to the US and Europe. Now, you don't do this just in Vietnam, you do this in 40 countries in the developing economies. That's where it all comes in. It is now really what I would call, instead of a direct trade export from China to the major markets, it's really an indirect export. Now, you may say, whoa, the Chinese are losing a great part of the supply chain. Yes, maybe in the short run, a little bit of the labor-intensive portion. But in the long run, I think China has always had the policy of trading upstream, more to the more capital and technology-intensive portions of the supply chain. And I will be very surprised if the value added of Chinese goods in the global supply chain will go down very much. But it may go down a little bit in the short run, and because of this phenomenon. So what you're really seeing right now is, in reaction to the geopolitics that I just mentioned, the world is really fragmenting, and you're seeing a complete new generation of supply chains. And I would even say that this is actually a new wave of globalization. Now, I might quickly look at the stakeholders. I mentioned China, yes. In fact, if China now is focusing on what we call dual circulation, right? Not just focusing on domestic economy, you want to add also the external economy. If you want to do that, you have no choice but to practice the model that I'm just saying, because there's no, the geopolitics doesn't allow you to otherwise. Now, what about the impact of the other major stakeholders, which is the recipient countries, the import countries? What's happening there? Yep. I think the politicians will see the trade made in China shipped to US and the made in China shipped to Europe go down. That is the political agenda, right? And that will be satisfied. However, if you look more broadly, the trade from all the developing economies to the US and to Europe is going up, up, and up. So all you're really doing is actually taking the direct trade into indirect trade, and that is going up substantially. I, for one, feel that in the long run, maybe it's not in the best interest of the importing countries to really cut off this source of, should we could say, high-value, low-cost goods. Why? Because there's something called inflation. You do not want to do this if you really cut off all imports, especially the low end. I think you're going to see a dramatic increase of inflation. I have always questioned the 2 to 3% target. I think you will be seeing a much different rate. Now, we can debate that. There's so many economists in the room that will give, including Mike, give a much better feel for this. I, for one, think it would be at least in the 4 to 5% range, if not higher. And if you then think through what does that mean in terms of pressure on interest rates, and in turn, the pressure on the economies, now you know why I think this actually is going to be a relatively stable situation for a period of time. But now that is the scenario that I'm really seeing. And having said that, let me now focus straight in on the impact on the emerging markets. Now, really, what is really happening is, as this develops, you might ask, what are the people doing in the developing economies? What they will be seeing is a wave of entrepreneurs coming. What do? They set up factories. Basically, it's inward investment. They actually then hire workers, train workers, and so on. That's capacity building. And then you do exports. That's great for developing economies. And then you earn foreign exchange. These are all the cycles, all the things that developing economies need to do in order to bring themselves up the economic development ladder. And in fact, what I'm really seeing is the whole idea of really the developing economies now. Perhaps you would see they haven't participated that much in the global supply chains in recent years. And let me give you some perspective. And now they're beginning to participate in the global supply chains in a major, major way. Now, why do I say that? If you go back to history, from the 1970s, Japan was the first to industrialize. When Japan got to a certain point, it basically downloaded the production, like what is actually happening now, okay, to the 4 little dragons of Asia. You remember that? South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, the 4 little dragons. And they took up, and then in turn, they cascaded down the labor intensive. And that whole development model of cascading down the production from more developed economies with very advanced production to the low was coined by a Japanese economist in the 1970s, Kaname Akamatsu. Some of you may actually know him, or he called this the flying geese model. They envisioned the top geese and then the formation, and then it's cascading down, flying geese. But starting from about 2000, basically as China became more and more the world's factory, you know what? The whole supply chain moved into China. And for a period of 20 years, basically it was developed in China and then exported from China. All the supply chain bits and pieces were all done domestically within China. And what is happening now is, because of geopolitics, it's coming back out from China again. It is actually, you may say, if I don't know Mr. Akamatsu, but he may say that the geese are flying again. We're back to the flying geese formation and a continuation now of the cascading down. It's actually a very interesting situation that we're now witnessing. The developing economies basically have not participated that much. Now, if you're a developing economy, frankly, if you think about it, unless I'm lucky enough to have, things like oil in the ground and I export that, if you think it through, really all you have is labor. Now, I hasten to add, there are good ways to monetize labor and there are very bad ways to monetize labor. You've got to think about monetizing labor to bootstrap yourself in the right way. Some countries, just to give an example, monetize it by sending workers overseas. This is the Philippines model. So many workers overseas, more than 20 billion US dollars inward remittance every year. It's a huge source. But in my mind, the most effective way and the way that you could do in scale is exactly what's happening. Doing the labor-intensive stage of the supply chain to begin with, that is a very good way to actually, in a sense, monetize your labor, and then to trade up the supply chain and then begin to do more and more local content, and then go up the chain, and then eventually, be able to produce your own product with complete local content, et cetera, et cetera. If you really think about it, the whole Chinese development model was exactly this one. If you go back to when Mr. Deng Xiaoping opened up China in 1980, the special economic zones, Shenzhen, Hong Kong worked really cooperatively with the southern part of China to, in fact, download the labor-intensive parts of the manufacturing chain. And China basically bootstrapped itself from exactly this model. And then from there, it traded up, and then you see the Chinese economy today. And in fact, that's a huge scale, right? I can see that model can be replicated step by step in different ways among different developing economies. And then I might add that you might ask the question, so who is going to do all this? I say moving production and so on. Who is going to do all this? Well, my answer is the following. If you think about the production now in China, I think the export-oriented production is mostly done by medium-sized enterprises within China. And in fact, who is the most efficient guys to actually globalize this production, this manufacturing process? I would suggest it is the medium-sized enterprises. As defined by central government, the medium-sized enterprises in US dollar sales terms with people with sales of 2 million US to 60 million US. And the last census is there are 45,000 of these medium-sized enterprises, mostly in the two deltas, the Yangtze River Delta around Shanghai, and importantly for us, the Greater Bay Area around Hong Kong. And these will be the front, the vanguard of actually this process going out. And I would just, maybe we can discuss this later on in our panel and so on, but Hong Kong could serve an extremely useful role as a hub to enable these medium-sized enterprises to go abroad. So going back to the big picture, the people that will be coming will be, really medium-sized enterprises, market-driven, very entrepreneurial. You don't need to teach them how to do business. They know better than you, okay? But one thing that I think I like to put a marker down is they must actually do their manufacturing as they globalize the manufacturing. I think they must do it in a compliant basis. They've got to really focus on all the elements of ESG. And I think I really think of this as a huge opportunity, but also if it's not done right, it could be a downside risk for many emerging economies and indeed the world. So we've got to think through, as this manufacturing process globalizes via these tens of thousands of medium-sized enterprises, okay? How do we actually train them, certify them, set standards, and so on, to make sure that the manufacturing is done on a compliant basis? And if it's done on a compliant basis, I think, if you ask me, that is the way to drive the sustainability agenda in a pragmatic manner. You know, I think you can talk big picture till you're blue in the face. How is this going to be done on the ground? So it's both an upside opportunity and a downside risk. And again, I think really in my mind, if I put on a Hong Kong hat, Hong Kong can play a major role in both enabling that process and making sure that that is done on a compliant basis with education, with certification, with standard setting. So this is really the picture. And the final thing before I close, I would just say that people are kind of thinking, okay, what about the future? I think the future, as this evolves, you know, I think you've got to bring in the element of technology in all its parts, right? You know, all the way to AI, and every day we see now the chat, but started really with IoT, you know, blockchains and so on. What we really see now is a technology now being applied to this global supply chain, which does several very important things. It really digitizes the whole supply chain that will enable, from a business standpoint, a model that is very responsive to the consumer needs. People are tying factory to the consumer through this technology. What used to take 6 months from the idea of a product to bring it to the consumer, now it'll be 4 to 6 weeks or less. And this, you know, and you can manufacture very small lots, which was not easy for the old factories because they need economy of scale. You can do small lot, fast response. And with the consumer now, every time you order something, you expect to arrive in 48 hours or maybe less. How do you think this is done? It is because the global supply chains are digitalized. And this actually allows the emerging economies now to actually participate in the global economy much faster than they would without this technology. So I think from a business standpoint, this is what I see. Manufacturing 4.0, in all the sense of that word, is being globalized because of the technology. And the other thing is, on the issue of sustainability, it allows us to go much deeper and more systematically into the supply chain. What we call tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers, meaning going up the supply chain all the way back to the farm. You can trace it with blockchains and so on. And that really, that traceability really allows you to really think about addressing practically and economically the whole sustainability question. So because of all this, we're at the cusp of this. And in my mind, you know, the opportunity that technology has created to allow this model, and most importantly, the small and medium-sized enterprises to participate in the global economy, and the fact that the emerging markets now have a means to participate and use this to bootstrap themselves up the economic ladder, I think is really bodes well for the future. You probably won't believe that I can take a pretty dire situation, translate into something that I'm concluded may have some hope for the future. You know, and I truly believe this. You know, this is what I see in the medium to long term. And I think we need to really think about how we actually make this sort of model a reality. Thank you very much.